You're listening to a Roddenberry podcast.
You're listening to Mission Log the Orville, an episode-by-episode discussion of the adventures of the crew of the USS Orville.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Mission Log the Orville. I'm so excited. We usually every week talk about an episode of the Orville and make a pun about the show that we're about to do, but today I don't have a pun. Today we don't have a show to talk about because season 3 isn't out. But today, Mike, what are we doing?
We are not going to open a jar of pickles, but what we are going to do is peel back the onion and talk to André Bormanis. André is the co-executive producer, science consultant, and screenwriter on the Orville. His name is on the dedication plaque of the NX-01 and NX-02, and apparently his 6 times great-grandson's name is on the dedication plaque of Voyager as well, so because that's about a 200-year difference. Here on Mission Log the Orville, we talk about the Orville and how its messages, morals, and meanings kind of affect us as people and let us make better decisions. Learn a little something about the human condition. Take a look, maybe an unbiased look at situations here, now, today, and just get into that a little bit more. So, Andre, we're delighted to have you. You first came upon my radar as a Next Gen fan, and when I saw your name on the credits for the Orville, I started doing a little research into you and just was like, I was kind of expecting, writer, English major, whatever, and I saw a very different background. So, and then I was just, you can hear it. It's a first season episode. I can't remember which one, but I was just astounded by your background, your qualifications. So why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
The most important thing, though, that we should note is that Andre is a cat person. We talked all about it. I just think that that's important that my things are reflected really quick, but carry on, Andre. It's very important.
I am first and foremost a total cat person.
There we go. That's what I wanted.
And, when I was 9 years old, I think, that 3rd or 4th grade or something, we had one of these little spring fling events at my grade school. I grew up in Phoenix. I was born in Chicago, but I grew up in Phoenix, Arizona. And somebody had a litter of kittens at the spring fling, and I begged my parents to let me get one. And they did. My dad was a cat person as well. Still is.
Oh, that's fortunate. That's fortunate.
And Smokey. I got this little gray kitten, Smokey, who was a Corrit in all probability. Not a purebred, but, closest breed we could figure out. And I got her when I was 9 years old. She didn't pass away until I was 32. That cat lived 23 years. She had 2 litters of kittens. She was indoor, outdoor, in Arizona.
That's impossible.
Snakes and coyotes and all of that. This was long before cats typically got vaccinated, Amazing cat. Lovely, beautiful cat. And yeah, Smokey lived to be 23. And I've had many cats since. Have 3 at the moment. One is a foster.
That sets up an unfair expectation for other cats' life expectations.
It does. Never had a cat that lived that long. My beloved Alfie died last year at the age of 16. Suki, who was another cat of mine, died a few years ago at 17, which is a pretty healthy lifespan.
My best friend and soulmate, I painted a picture of him, died last year. It was my first putting down experience.
It's very hard. It's very difficult because, I don't have kids. And I guess at some level, the cat, becomes your child.
Yeah, totally.
Strange as that might sound.
Each of them are different. So he was like my boyfriend soulmate. I showed you my big Russian blue. He's like my brother. And Pepper, my little old girl, she's like my girlfriend. She's like, so they have like different emotional bonds.
Different roles in your life there.
Correct. Yes, you're a Chicagoan, Arizonian. You have
Chicagoan, Arizonan, and, huge original series fan growing up. I remember, I'm so old. I do remember seeing a couple of episodes in first run of the original series in the 60s with my older brother. And I didn't understand them. I didn't get it, but I was fascinated by it.
So you're not that old.
I'm not that old. And I didn't really get into Star Trek like so many people from that era until into the 70s when it became popular in syndication, and I was in high school. And I noticed when you talked to David Goodman, he mentioned the book, The Making of Star Trek. Right. I also read that book in high school, and it was kind of like my Bible for a while. Me and several friends were just totally blown away by the idea that, oh, wow, there's this whole world behind the scenes in the making of the show, the writing of it, the acting, the producing, all of the different elements that go together. And I was a kid who grew up watching TV, and you don't really think about that too much when you're young. You're watching the stories, watching the acting, and so forth. And I knew people wrote the scripts, and I knew a few of the names because I read a lot of science fiction as a kid. So I was familiar with people like Harlan Ellison and Theodore Sturgeon and Robert Bloch. But man, to have my eyes opened about what an amazing, fun job that must be, to do something like this. And of course, at that time, at that age, I never would have imagined that I would end up writing for television, let alone writing for a Star Trek series. In fact, several that I wrote for. And, Star Trek was a big part of what inspired me to get interested in astronomy and physics. And that's what I studied in college. And I went to grad school and I did policy work for the space program. I had a NASA fellowship to earn my master's degree at the George Washington University. And my focus was primarily policy issues in the U.S. planetary science exploration program.
Can I ask you what that is? Because I have a guess as to what it is. But when you say policy, are you talking about how money is allocated and how it's represented in our government, or
yes?
Okay.
When it comes to federal space policy, the budget is the policy ultimately.
Got it.
How much money are we going to spend on NASA, and what fraction of that money is going to go to, say, missions to Jupiter's icy moons or missions to the surface of Mars, versus the International Space Station, versus, some of the space telescopes like Hubble and Webb now. So yeah, it is a lot of that. And it's basically, how do you establish priorities? What gets funding and what doesn't?
This probably lends itself really well into you being a producer now.
It does at some level. And in fact, I used to joke with my thesis advisor that, writing policy reports and doing research and writing position papers was good preparation for writing fiction. Because it's not that stuff, is made up. We don't, we're not trying to be dishonest. But when you are trying to promote a particular policy, you're an advocate. And
right.
And these papers, they have a narrative structure,
You're selling someone on the idea or a story, and it's all presentation, right? Ultimately, like how do you help someone's? Because we're not accustomed to reading legal documents. We're not encouraged to. But every time I'm pitching something or I want someone to understand it, I am making sure I bold, outline, underline, footnote properly. But because you're encouraging the easiest, you want the lowest entry point to be available to somebody.
Yeah, and the best advocates are really good storytellers. They're teachers. They're people like Carl Sagan and Neil deGrasse Tyson. Who were so good at telling the public why this is important, why it matters, because they're both really good storytellers.
Right.
I have this
really
in my
good
notes.
At developing that narrative and the excitement and the build and the climax and the resolution, all of that stuff goes into
Here's why not. I think that's, you just unlocked a piece that makes sense to me intrinsically, but it's good to hear it just put it out blankly like that. I like that. So I'm sorry, Mike, what were you going to say?
I was going to say, I have in my notes, I was going to ask about it later, but since you were talking about these great storytellers, in the forward to a book, essays on the Orville, you mentioned working with Ray Bradbury at some point.
Cool.
Yes.
And that, again, just the many, many layers to the onion that is you. What was that like? And when did you have a chance to do that?
He was my hero growing up. And, I knew I wanted to write. I wanted to study physics and astronomy, but I like being kind of at the intersection of art and science. if that makes sense.
It does.
I always loved the aesthetic aspects of astronomy. I love the writing of people like Carl Sagan and Ray Bradbury because it was so poetic and lyrical and and compelling. And I just, that turned me on to, science in a way that no textbook ever could, right? Uh-huh. And so I knew I wanted to try to do something like that. And this is one of many sort of weird synchronicities in my life. When I was a student at the University of Arizona, studying physics, sophomore year, I wanted to have some social activity, meet some new people and stuff. And they had a thing called the Speakers Bureau that organized lectures from, famous people from around the world who would come to the U and talk, right? And I'd been to a couple of those when I was a freshman and thought they were good and interesting. So I thought, the Speakers Bureau, they had a little ad in the Daily Wildcat, our school newspaper, saying they were
very
looking for
Arizona.
the Speakers Bureau. So I thought, hey, I'll check it out. So it was just me and this one woman who was, I think, a senior at the time, and we were it. It's like, well, we got to put together a schedule for like 5 speakers or something like that for the coming, year. And she said, we've actually got our first speaker lined up. It's Ray Bradbury. Would you like to pick him up at his hotel, take him to dinner, and then introduce him for his talk in 2 weeks?
Yeah.
Of course.
Would imagine saying no because you're just like, I don't want to meet my heroes.
Yeah, I was very nervous at some level too because I knew that he didn't drive, so it's like I'm 19 years old or whatever, and I'm going to drive Ray Bradbury from his hotel to this restaurant and then to the talk.
I'm nervous for you, and this happened 30 years ago.
And,
so
I've been driving for a couple of years.
Yeah,
and it wasn't even my own car; it was some big sedan that the school owned. Right?
Oh my God, this is amazing!
Oh, crap! I have to drive this boat, down. At any rate, I go to the hotel, I go to the front desk, and, I'm here to see Mr. Bradbury, and here comes Ray and his wife, and I'm just like, I'm shuddering almost. I was so excited. And I said, Mr. Bradbury, hello, here to take you to dinner. Oh, it's nice to meet you. And we're starting to walk, and I couldn't contain myself, right? And I just finally kind of said, Mr. Bradbury, when I was 11 years old, I read the Martian Chronicles, and I thought it was just the most amazing thing I'd ever read. Very much like that.
Yeah, yeah.
And he kind of chuckled, and he put his hand on my shoulder, and he said, it's terrific. I love hearing that. They're making a TV miniseries out of it. I'm like, oh, my God, Rock Hudson's going to be, what? And then it was just like, life is but a dream. It was so great, and he was so lovely. And I showed him a couple of bad poems. I showed him a couple of bad poems I'd written.
Oh,
and I remember showing those 2 bad poems to one of my English professors, and she was just she really didn't. Yeah. I showed them to Bradbury, and he read them. They were both brief, fortunately. And he looked at me and he said, "How many poems have you written?" And I said, "Well, really, just these 2." And he said, "Write 1,000 more. The only way you get good at anything is through practice." He said, "I tried to write poetry for 20 years before I wrote what I thought was my first half-decent poem." Now, that's the difference between a teacher and an academic.
Right.
And that was hugely inspirational to me.
Because he didn't say no. He didn't say, don't do this. He didn't say, you don't
have it. He didn't say whether it was good or bad or, He knew exactly what to say to encourage somebody who clearly had some aspirations but was young and inexperienced and, was going to take some time to develop.
Well, inexperienced, of course, because you are young. I have Ray Bradbury in the back of my head who's like, don't tell people your idea, otherwise the story is told, Like there's... his impact is huge, and so it's really cool to hear you share that. So
but years later, when I was working as the science consultant on Star Trek, I was also a volunteer at the Planetary Society, and they were planning a fundraising event featuring the works of Ray Bradbury. Ray Bradbury was an advisor to the Planetary Society and lived in California, in Los Angeles. And they were going to put together this set of readings. And they asked me, would you like to sit down with Ray and start trying to figure out which ones, and could you invite some of the actors on Star Trek to participate in this? And I'm like, sure.
Like, you probably got transported right back to 19-year-old.
Oh, I so did. And, it was just so great to be able to kind of hang out with him and talk to him and talk about his stories and what should we do here and what we, and who can we get for this and who can we get for that. And he was always just so excited, anything that he did, he brought like the full power of his passion to. And I saw him, the last time I saw him, there was a production of a play that he'd written many, many years ago called Leviathan 99. And Ray was 87 or 88 years old at the time, and it was just put up in this tiny little theater with no budget and no special effects.
I know what you're talking
guys
about.
in spacesuits made out of aluminum foil, but Ray was just loving it. And, it was a pretty good performance, and it was, it's a good play, it wasn't staged particularly well, but, I remember afterwards, my wife and I were sitting at a table just next to the table that Bradbury was sitting at with a couple of the actors having a little drink or something afterwards. And Ray was like, so what are we going to do next? Like a little kid, 87, 88 years old, still as enthusiastic as he was the day he started. So that was, I spent a lot more time talking about Ray Bradbury than I thought I would here, but it was so formative for me,
Well, especially as someone who has a lot of good fortune now in your life, it's got to leave well, first of all, Ray had that good fortune of following his passion and becoming successful in it.
Yes.
It sounds like, I love that you use the word synchronicity, because I do believe if you follow your true north, your life will take you, if you're open to saying yes, it'll take you down a path. And then all of a sudden you are meeting people that you and it looked up to and then get to be in those positions. So I'm sure.
Yeah, so it was Ray and Star Trek and Carl Sagan. And, huge Carl Sagan fan growing up, met him, was going to work with him on a project that the Planetary Society, which he co-founded, was putting together. And sadly, tragically, he died from this rare blood disorder just before this Planet Fest event that the Planetary Society put on in 1997. And but did get to meet him a couple of times, and then I've worked with his widow, Andrian, who is an amazing writer and poet and teacher in her own right. And she was the powerhouse behind the 2 new seasons of Cosmos with Neil deGrasse Tyson.
Oh,
and I got to work on both of those with Brannon. And it's because of Seth MacFarlane that those 2 new seasons of Cosmos got made. Right. And he's an executive producer on both of them.
So I didn't know this when I was doing a show that took influences from like Contact and Annihilation, and so I rewatched Contact, remembering it as a child, and I did not realize that Carl Sagan was such a huge, was the reason that happened, and also died before that came out too.
Yeah.
So
before. Yeah.
So sad, but like also, what better way to live your life than as fully as possible? Like a la David Bowie, who's like, you know what, I'm going to put an album out and then I'm going to die.
Yeah.
I'm going to do as much as I can. I have a very short anecdote, but at the time I was watching the Cosmos, the newer versions 4 or 5 years ago, I was still smoking pot, and I was living in Chatsworth with my mom, and Chatsworth is adjacent to the Northridge Northridge, where the Northridge earthquake was.
I remember it well.
I slept through it, but I was awake for every aftershock thereafter. It was wild. And
is that why you started smoking pot, or is that why you quit smoking?
So my therapist would say the trauma. So no, I probably quit. I quit because I'm actually too paranoid, and it just doesn't serve me.
Yes.
I welcome anyone else who it works for to enjoy it. It doesn't serve me anymore. But I was smoking a little bit of pot. My mom probably didn't know. I'm watching, having a great time watching the Cosmos, and just as Neil deGrasse Tyson is explaining tectonic plates and earthquakes, an aftershock occurs at the same exact time, which I recognize the coincidence of I'm in the right place, right time. But being a little high, I was like, what the hell? Anyway, there's so much more to talk about, and the Cosmos is part of that. You're part of that. I also am so excited to learn about how you drop into Star Trek and then come into the Orville, because Mike said this exactly right. You didn't come into the writer's room exactly like how everyone else did. Your physics and love of science brought you into that.
Yeah, it was a long story how I got offered the job of being the science consultant Star Trek. It was the final season of Next Generation and the second season of Deep Space Nine. And Narain Shankar, my predecessor in the job, had been promoted to the writing staff, so they were looking for a new science consultant, a job that Narain kind of created. I mean, they'd used a lot of scientists as resources, going back to the original series. But to have somebody kind of who was their point person and who was always on call and would read every script was something that Narain really got the ball rolling for. And when he got promoted to the writing staff, they needed somebody new. And I was in the process of trying to find somebody who could get me in the door to pitch some story ideas I had for Next Gen. I was still living in Washington, D.C., and going to grad school, and found out that they were looking for this new science consultant. And an agent put me up for it and hit it off on the phone with Jerry Taylor, who was one of the writers and producers. She and I, had a nice conversation while I was in D.C., and she invited me out to meet the staff, and Michael Piller gave me a little audition, gave me a script that he wanted tech notes on. And so I read that and wrote up my notes. And a couple of weeks later, they called and said, if you want the job, it's yours. And speaking of synchronicity, they needed me to start literally the week that my NASA fellowship at George Washington University ended in May of 1993. And I loaded up the truck and I moved to Beverly, and I figured I'd give it a couple of years. And if I could make a go of it as a writer, kind of make a living at doing this sort of thing, great. If not, I could always go back to DC and, continue to do policy work, because, that's a big part of what people in that town do, right?
Not a bad fallback, it sounds like. Either.
No, it was not a bad fallback at all.
So you've got this job as a science consultant on Next Gen and Deep Space Nine. Do you remember what script it was that he had you hash out?
Yes.
Do some work
the audition script was, I think, a second draft that he'd written of a Deep Space Nine story called If Wishes Were Horses.
Really?
Yeah, about a kind of a weird little alien leprechaun sort of character that comes onto the station and starts mucking with the laws of probability or something like that.
Oh my God, what a challenge too. Then if they're
there was a lot of techie stuff in it, and this was back before the internet, young people. Yeah. Before smartphones or any others.
And that script did make it to production, if I remember right. There was an episode that weird things started happening, like everybody started winning at Dabo and
something like that. Yeah. It did get made. I remember it did get made. I don't remember how many of my notes made it into that episode, but I had a planetary science conference in Tucson, and then I drove to LA to have this meeting at Paramount, which was in and of itself amazing, going to the Hart Building and meeting Michael Piller and Ira Stephen Bear and Brandon Braga and Jerry Taylor and Renee Echevarria. Michael Taylor, I think, was there at the time. It was just like, holy crap. And so after that meeting, I drove to Phoenix to my parents' house, went to the library to get some reference books, and read Michael's script and started scribbling notes.
Wow.
Typed them up on my dad's home computer and then faxed them back to the Hart Building the next day, and then got on a plane and flew back to DC.
Brilliant.
Wow.
Yeah.
And then drove out to LA when you got the job.
Yeah, I know. Crazy.
Well, and I'm friends with the science officer now for Star Trek, Dr. Aaron. Yeah.
Dr. Aaron Mack.
Yeah.
Oh, Aaron, yes. I've only met Aaron once. She's great.
She is so cool. I've got a chance. She's a good friend, but I've also seen her speak about, she taught me that there was 4 masses of energy, or no, not, I forget it. I'm not
4 fundamental forces of nature.
Yes, but but I didn't know that plasma was also a form of...
Oh, state of matter, yes.
There we go. I just didn't know. Anyway.
Oh, yeah, solid, liquid, gas, plasma.
Thank you.
4 states of matter.
She did, but I'm like, why didn't I get taught about that? But I'm glad. Anyway, she's very cool. I'm happy that she has the job. And she's obviously part of an awesome legacy.
I hope so. I mean, it was a great gig while I had it. And in fact... I started, I think I pitched something like 15 stories.
Wow.
Before I sold the first one, over the course of 2.5 years. And it was, I felt discouraged at times. And, I started thinking about other shows I could pitch. I had an agent. I figured, hey, if I'm not getting any traction at Star Trek, I should, think of myself as a writer and go pitch other shows.
Right.
But then I got a call from Jerry Taylor. They Michael loved my latest pitch. They bought it, and a month later, they bought another one that I pitched some time earlier that I'd totally forgotten about. And then I think the following season, they were shorthanded on the writing staff, and they had a story, but they didn't have anybody to write the script. And Jerry called me and said, "Would you like to write the teleplay?" And I'm like, "Oh, sure." So 2 weeks or so, we had an outline, and I was in on the so-called story break, where we take the basic short story version of the idea and turn it into scenes and an outline. And then I went home, and 2 weeks later I turned in my script, and everybody seemed to really like it. Michael Piller changed, a few things, but not necessarily a lot. And so every season I did either, like a story or a script or, some combination of the two. And then I got to know the writers a lot better. Brandon Braga and I wrote a script together for the final season of Voyager, which we were both very happy with, and everybody seemed to like. And then when Star Trek Enterprise started, Brandon was the showrunner, and he said, it's ridiculous to just keep you in this science consultant position. Let's make you a full-time writer. So I became a writer and producer on Enterprise, and I've just been writing and producing TV shows ever since.
I'm going to let Mike take over, but what I'm realizing is that, and this is what really is heartening, and you can tell, this radiates to the warmth of the Orville. You all end up on the Orville because someone said, "Hey, you should meet this person," or "You should work here," or Brandon goes, "You know what, you should be a writer." As opposed to keeping people down, you all see it's a friendship that you guys are fostering. And it doesn't seem like competitive is part of this business in a sense, but you're not my competition. I'm my own competition, and your tenacity to continue pitching scripts, that speaks to you. But then you get to these places where even, David is saying to Seth, "Hey, why don't you take a spot on Star Trek Enterprise or something like that?"
Yeah. And, it's I've had bad experiences too. I mean, the Star Trek was great. I did 12 years. From when I started as the science consultant to when Enterprise was canceled. That's an amazing run. I worked on 4 different Star Trek series, not everything from after the original. So Next Gen, DS9, Voyager, and Enterprise. And then, of course, there was no more Star Trek other than some films, for a number of years. And figured I'd never work on a spaceship again, right? That I worked on a show with Brandon called Threshold. It didn't even last a full season, But
it was a brilliant show.
Thank you. Yeah, we were very proud of it, very happy with it.
Jessica, you mentioned giving me a chance to ask questions again. I feel like I'm doing a great job as a facilitator when I don't have to talk. So, Andre, you have been hitting all of my notes.
Oh, good.
Like everything that I have bulletized on my note, you're just picking them off one by one. So this is working out wonderful. But I did want to ask you a little bit about Threshold, because in my mind, that's right up there with Firefly and the brilliant but canceled shows that just did not last long enough to go.
I felt that way too. It was, first of all, what an amazing cast. Carla Cugina, Peter Dinklage, Brent Spiner, Charles Dutton.
Right.
The rest of the cast, all really top-rate actors. Carla was great to work with. She was totally bringing it every day, and was a great lead. I wrote the episode that featured a guest star by the name of Viola Davis, who was a kind of unknown at the time. And I'm like, I wish I could claim that I discovered Viola Davis. Of course, that's not even remotely true, but I did write an early script that in her career that she was great, of course. And then, there were 2 other, we were on CBS, and there were 2 other alien invasion themed shows, one on each of the other networks, NBC and ABC, and none of us made it quite a full season, as I recall. And then I didn't work for like a couple of years other than little odd jobs here and there. And that was, I was damn lucky that I had, some income from residuals from Star Trek, having written, I think I wrote or co-wrote about 20 episodes altogether between Voyager and Enterprise.
Right.
And then a couple of years later, after Threshold, I got a job on 11th Hour, another CBS show. And that was a great experience because I met another great writing staff led by Cy Voris and Ethan Reef and Ilya Modrovich and Heather Mitchell and Ben Lee and Speed Weed and Angel Dean Lopez. Great group of writers. Kim Newton.
How sweet.
again, really terrific show. Rufus Sewell was the star. Marley Shelton co-starred. Great fun stuff. FBI agent who, works with this kind of brilliant but erratic scientist to help solve these crazy crimes.
Love this.
I think we did 15 episodes and out. And then I was on some shows that weren't very good experiences, that didn't have, that there was sort of backstabbing or, competitiveness among writers, not very well run, and it was, it was a mixed bag there for a while until Brannon called me and said that Seth MacFarlane wanted to do this new season of Cosmos with Ann Druyan, and the astronomer that Ann had been working with, unfortunately, couldn't stay with the show because he had other commitments, and there was some work that yet needed to be done on some of the scripts, mostly technical, astronomy type, historical, history of science type stuff. So they brought me in.
And for perspective, this was 2012, 13, 14.
Yeah.
Somewhere on that timeline.
Yeah, and then after that, I did this Mars show for the National Geographic that was a kind of a hybrid documentary drama. Very good writing staff. We had a director who was kind of in over his head and unfortunately decided that he could only shoot 3 pages a day instead of 6. So basically threw out half of our work and brought in his own writer to kind of redo it. And then, his grandiose visions were basically headshots.
But that was a really interesting format. That was the show that was kind of like half documentary, half speculative science fiction, but very hard science.
Yeah, and it was produced by Ron Howard and Brian Glazer. And Ron came in. We met with Ron for about 3 hours, and he had all sorts of great ideas for how to really integrate the narrative drama and the documentary side of things, none of which our esteemed director really paid attention to or knew how to implement, sadly. But it was good enough that it got a second season, which I wasn't involved with, but that was kind of cool.
How does that happen? How does someone who isn't right for the project put at the helm of a project?
Well, he did direct. He directed a film. He's a Mexican guy. He directed a film that was very good, I thought, about drug runners near the border. And, nice enough guy. I don't have anything
not the
against
right
him
setting
personally.
for them.
His brother worked for the production company, apparently, which is how we found out about him and how he got the job, I think, ultimately. But no, he had a nice sample of a feature film, but it's like, I think I could have told him that somebody who's never worked in television, a feature schedule is a much different thing than a TV schedule, especially if it's an independent film that you made on your, yourself and probably didn't even have a certain end date, right? Could have just done it, however long it took you to do it. So that was unfortunate, but
there's so many things that happen. Okay. There's so many things that happen behind the scenes that we'll just never know, like that will lend itself to why something does work, doesn't work.
Right.
But it's clear the Orville does work. I would love to know how much fun you have or how little fun you have working on this show, or or what's it like for you?
I think I can say, without hesitation, the best writer's room I've ever had the privilege of working in. Seth is so smart and such a good writer, such a good leader. I always knew he was very funny and a very good comedy writer. I had no idea what a good 1-hour drama writer he was. And, like a lot of people, I think when the show was first announced, there was this expectation that it was going to be, a comedy in space,
Right.
That it was going to be a much more... Not Family Guy per se. It was never going to be that, but it was going to be more of a, The Office or whatever.
Oh, sure.
And that was never really Seth's intention. I think, he can speak for himself about his own experiences and his, his desire to make the show and so forth. But he was a big fan of Star Trek: The Next Generation growing up. Big Star Trek fan generally. And he was missing that kind of aspirational science fiction storytelling on TV. Everything had gotten so dark. And everything, like post-Sopranos became serialized. Episodic, kind of high-concept science fiction was really none of that on television for the longest time.
Wow.
And, Star Trek Discovery and some of these other shows, the more recent shows, they're also very serialized. And, I haven't watched a lot of those shows. I think they're interesting, and I'm glad that the franchise is strong and growing. And I'm glad that Roddenberry, whom I've known for many years, has been so successful with, guiding these shows and getting them, to what extent he works on them, I'm not really clear. But of course, he's involved as the keeper of the legacy. And, that's all great, but it's different. It's not the kind of show that Seth wanted to do. And so Seth, created the Orville. It's something he thought about for a long time. And he obviously had a couple of appearances on Star Trek Enterprise. And I think David Goodman probably told you the story of how that all came about.
Yeah, he sure did.
And
Ensign Rivers.
And that was great. And, one thing I remember about that, Terry Metalis, who was Brannon's assistant at the time, and Terry is now the showrunner on Picard. Terry went on to do great things. He wrote a couple of episodes of Enterprise, as I recall, came up with a couple of very good stories. And then he got a job writing for the 12 Monkeys series, and I think he became the showrunner on that. And then more recently, last year sometime, got chosen to be the co-showrunner of Picard. And I remember Terry begging Seth to do one take in this, in the one line that Seth had down in the engineering or wherever he was on the ship. Terry's like, do one as Stewie. Do one as Stewie. Just one as Stewie. Do that Stewie line. Seth wouldn't do it. He said, no, I'm hired to do a job here. I'm a provisional. He was,
over here.
Obviously, had a lot of fun with Terry, joking about that. But I got to tell you, what a delight it's been for me to be in the writer's room with Seth, David Goodman, Brannon Braga, Cherry Chiva-Prabhat-Dumrong, who you should have on the show, who's amazing.
I would love to talk to her.
We spoke about her at length.
Yeah, and then Liz Heldens, who also phenomenal writer, one of the best writers working in television today or any time. And and then we've had a few other writers like Dan O'Shannon and Wellesley Wild and Julius Sharp, Aaron Lee. They've all worked on the show, and Janet Lynn, who's terrific, who I knew way back when on I think she was a writer's assistant on. God, it was either Threshold or 11th Hour.
Okay.
She became very, very successful, and she's a very talented writer and executive.
That brings up a question that we've had since we started covering season 1, which was, I watch an episode of Next Gen, and there's story by, teleplay by, written by, and usually there could be as many as 10 people listed in those 3 credits.
Yeah.
Every episode of the Orville that I remember seeing has a singular written by for each episode. Yet it's still sounds like it's a team effort.
It always is, and different shows handle the credits issue differently. Every show I've worked on, some subset of the writing staff is developing and breaking stories, and by breaking, I simply mean you got an idea, you think it's going to work, you see the shape of it, the beginning, the middle, and the end. You have to break it down into individual scenes, and that's typically done as a group in the writer's room. And, what's the first scene? Well, you write down a little description, the Orville flying at quantum, interior bridge, Ed and Kelly are talking about this, that, and the other, right? So in the Orville, most of the ideas, a lot of it really originates with Seth. This is his vision and something that he's really, been passionate about for a long time now. And gosh, I started on the show in 2016, I guess. Before we had cast the show, before we knew what the ship looked like, what rooms we're going to see, are we going to see engineering? Is that going to be a set? I think the only actor who we knew was going to be on the show for sure was Scott Grimes as Gordon.
I knew it.
Yeah, and Seth, of course, is the captain. Everything else.
I'm surprised that was decided ahead of time.
Yeah, but anyway, it was like, we were just kind of flying blind, talking about different story ideas. And, Seth always, again, what he emphasized was that we want this to be a show that is about something. We want every episode to be, at some level, a sort of morality tale. High concept science fiction, always welcome. That's the kind of thing we want to do. And so we would talk and we would pitch and we would talk about what's going on in the world and what we liked and what we didn't like about what's going on in the world and whether there was any story fodder for us, that 25th century perspective on a present day social problem, which, the original Star Trek did so brilliantly.
It did. When I was in grad school, I took a class called Technology from a Global Perspective. And at that point, I really was able to kind of connect the dots that science fiction, when it's done well, isn't about the future. It's not about 500 years from now. It's not about quantum drives. It's not about, plasma pistols. It's about us right here, right now, and how we can explore that from a global perspective.
Yes.
And, reading, again, some words that you've written, about 25% of the words are about science, and about 75% of the words are about philosophy and exploring the human condition. And I find that just fascinating from somebody that started off as a science advisor, but that heart of exploring who we are right now, right here, from an unbiased point of view.
Sort of biased. I mean,
what I'm getting at is if it was set on Earth right here, right now, people would already have their biases of, this civilization or that civilization or this coast or that coast or, middle America. But if it's a different planet and you're in orbit and you're seeing them for the first time, now you're looking at something from a more or less unbiased.
Yeah. And it's also, the fact that our characters certainly have their flaws and their imperfections, but they come from a much more enlightened culture than our present day culture.
Right.
And one of the great lines that Seth came up with in I forget which episode now, but this idea that kind of social enlightenment comes before the technological advancement can get very far, right? Because it's a little bit. It's kind of, if we don't get our act together, we're probably going to not last very long as a species.
Right.
Once you develop a certain level of technology and once your population grows to a size where you can afford to, keep most people clothed and fed and housed, there's going to be a lot of pressure on that society, and you're going to run into a lot of problems. I mean, clearly, global warming prior to the pandemic was the biggest concern. Well, now we're also worried about, deadly diseases like COVID, and this is maybe the first real pandemic in 100 years since the so-called Spanish flu, which actually started in Kansas.
Right.
But
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Wow.
It was spread by soldiers going toward the end of the war from being trained in Kansas. It started there, and then they took it to Spain. And Spain started talking about it openly. They were the first country to discuss the fact that there's this thing going around. A lot of people were in denial about it.
Talk about making something political. Wow.
I know, right? And then, this clown Putin doing his craziness. I mean, it's just like, if we don't learn how to live together much better than we do right now, you're not going to have a civilization.
Or do we deserve to? I think we do deserve to, but I think that's a good. So many times in the show, Mike and I will just pause and go, "What an impactful statement that makes!" Essentially,
and question. One of the things that I've noticed, and we talk about a lot, is that the show doesn't have, it doesn't get lectury. It doesn't, it doesn't have that, what we call the "you see Timmy" moment. It asks a question, and normally sometime in the middle of the show, Kelly and Ed will sit down, or Kelly and Claire will sit down, and they'll kind of discuss the situation and ask the questions to try to get us to think. And I think it's brilliant.
Yeah. Well, in one of the early episodes, that we discussed and we did in season 1 was majority rule.
Right.
with the planet very much like present day Earth, where everything is decided in a sort of a quote unquote pure democracy, where every citizen votes on every issue, and it's evolved to the point where they're not just voting on issues, but also who gets canceled,
right?
Whose inappropriate social behavior becomes censured, and that person then has to be corrected. And this all came from a discussion that we were having in the room one day about, cancel culture and, wokeness and whatever else, you might want to call it. And, to some extent, those are good things. It should, people who do bad things should be censured at some level, and people who break the law obviously need to, to pay the price. But, every good idea gets taken too far by somebody at some point. And, one can make the case that, we maybe went a little too far with our eagerness, at least, to sort of quote unquote cancel people. This public shaming, that started,
right.
and clearly a consequence of social media, and that's another thing that we wanted to talk about and look at from this 25th century perspective. And of course, we have characters who are themselves not the sort of idealized human beings of, the next generation crew and so forth. So you have somebody like John Lamar.
Yeah.
And
Why don't you both pick on John Lamar first?
Hold on. It's the only choice in that first season. I'm like, why the hell would he do that? It is the dumbest thing. Well, but it actually offers me
that statue of Mela Griffindon was looking pretty darn good.
Don't say that. You're going to get canceled, Mike. So she's a woman who was there for us. Just because she was a woman doesn't mean she can be objectified. So, but this does allow me the opportunity to compliment you and the writers' room on something that I talk about often, is how smart it was for you to make the decision, and maybe you can speak to whether it was a conscious decision or just rolled out this way, to individually introduce us to each character that we were going to learn to love, so that we could really see why they make the choices moving forward. So as opposed to going, let's dive into all the Krill issues and make sure we have a really bad villain. Let's just see how Alaric Katan can handle the con. Let's see, how Gordon does now that he doesn't know what he wants to do or whatever. So I really think it's a testament to why the show is actually cared about so much.
I think so. I agree. And thank you for saying that. I think that it was always baked in from the beginning in Seth's mind, because it was an ensemble cast from the beginning. And, he hired, obviously, we have a great cast. And, Penny Johnson-Gerald and Scott and Jay Lee and Peter Macon and Mark, who plays Isaac.
Totally. Yes.
And it was clear at the beginning and clear in Seth's mind that we have to think about these characters, and to the extent that a story can grow out of character, it's going to be a more engaging story. It's hard to just say we want to tackle a social issue.
If we didn't have Into the Fold or A Happy Refrain, then Identity Part 1 and 2 would have meant nothing.
Yes, that's correct.
And that investment in character and relationship development is something that's missing on other shows.
Yeah, I think you're right. Again, I don't watch a lot of other TV. I don't really have the time. I watch a lot of these little miniseries and things nowadays, or, just Top Chef or whatever.
Which is good, because you need to turn your brain off sometimes, I'm sure.
Yes. And I turn mine off often. So.
I do that with BBC stuff like The Taskmaster and Bake Off, because I don't have to think too hard. It's
right. Exactly. Plus, when you got 3 cats you need to keep entertained, it's hard to necessarily focus.
I can't do a toy and watch TV at the same time.
Well, of course not.
They deserve full attention.
But yeah, we're blessed. We have a great cast, and Seth is very much, a character-oriented writer. And, coming back to the writer's room and how we develop the stories and so forth, it is just great fun to be in the room with Seth and the rest of the gang. David Goodman possibly being an exception. I kid David Goodman.
We can edit that out if you need to.
No.
Okay.
David knows I'm teasing. He's not even going to watch this. Why would he watch
Probably not.
Please.
I wouldn't.
Please leave it.
I wouldn't watch it because anyway. So there's a few. I think we have like 10 more minutes with you, and there's so much. We could talk to you forever.
But we just started.
The show just kept getting better and better. And it was accepted by the fans right away. Very high fan rating on places like Rotten Tomatoes. The critics, not so much, but the critics eventually came around. And it seemed like season 2, somewhere around the second half, I kind of identified lasting impressions. The episode where Leighton Meester guest starred, and lovely episode. As a pilot myself, and that being a Gordon Malloy episode, it really spoke to me in a very personal way. But right around that time, there seemed to be a switch that got flipped, where all of a sudden, like, friends started telling friends about that show, and the ratings just really started to go up. Is that a result of that second half of season 2? Success, was that a result of the show just starting to gel? Is there measurable data that you look at as far as like what kind of stories do people like? What's kind of the continuous improvement mechanism?
Well, I think we're always trying to top ourselves. We're always trying to do better, to be better. We obviously knew the characters better at that point. We knew the show better. We were comfortable with each other as writers, producers. I think probably the more significant aspect of all of that was it takes any show time to find an audience. And sadly, in the more recent years of television, shows were not given enough time to really find their audiences. I think that's changing because there's such a demand for content, and so many scripted shows on the air now that people do give them a chance. It becomes more and more niche programming, right? Because nobody can watch everything that's on television. Back in the 60s and 70s and 80s, I mean, you could probably follow all of the hit shows, right? But today, it's impossible. So I think that, it took people time to find the Orville. It took people time to understand what we were trying to do that wasn't, Family Guy in space. It was a different kind of a thing. And some people, I think, had trouble with that. They had like, wait a minute, what are you trying to do here? And I'm not sure if I'm comfortable with this. Are you a comedy or are you a 1-hour drama? It's like, well, we're a little bit of a hybrid, The comedy, I think, it's certainly not nearly as sort of broad and jokey as Family Guy. It's something that comes, I think, more from the peculiarities of the characters.
Right.
And I think one of the things we talked about as the show developed was that tonally, it's a little more like sort of later seasons of MASH. MASH was a comedy, it was a sitcom, and it started off as a very, it was always a laugh. Every scene had 2 or 3 good laughs. Became much more serious in tone in the later episodes because, after they're on for a few years, it's like, we really can't avoid the fact that this show is taking place during a war. And it's
kind of the elephant in the room.
And these are surgeons who are dealing with people who are, grievously wounded and often don't recover from their wounds. And they embrace that more and more. They always did it, even from the beginning. And one of the interesting things that you'll notice if you watch MASH is that there is a laugh track on the show, right? You never hear the laugh track when they're in the operating room. Even when they're making wisecracks and stuff, you never hear the laugh track when they're in the operating room, which I think is a very interesting aspect of how they did that show. And it was, I'm sure that was a difficult line for them to walk, and it was a risk when they started to do sort of more serious themes, let's say, in those later years of MASH. So we kind of, we're not trying to imitate MASH by any means, but that the fact that it could do both well was something that, we were striving for ourselves.
And we don't make art in a vacuum.
Right.
And so being able to point to they've seen success in this direction only will help bolster your endeavors.
Yes.
And they're probably able to achieve what they did because people cared about those characters so much.
Exactly.
Too. So yeah, it's interesting.
And I've worked in office environments, and I've worked on with crews. We're out on extended period of time together. It's fun. It's funny. You're gonna laugh. Things are gonna
Yeah.
happen that are silly and stupid, and you get fatigued. And when you're
Right.
tired, there's nothing more fun than being a tired, tired idiot. You just things get funny, and I have laughed harder at work than I think
Yeah.
I have at other places. So to think that this environment would exist without laughter, without jokes, without comic relief between.
Well, and with all of the inevitable Star Trek comparisons, a lot of people forget that the original Star Trek had a lot of humor in it.
Had a lot of comedy
Probably
episodes.
more so than Next
Yep.
Gen. They had obviously blatantly funny episodes like The Trouble with Tribbles and Piece of the Action. Roddenberry didn't necessarily initially want to do that. At least I've heard that he didn't want to have a lot of comedic stuff. And I don't think he wanted to do the Tribbles episode, actually, which is arguably the most popular of all of the original series episodes, because he was afraid it would become, the show wouldn't be taken as seriously, and he wanted to do this serious adult science fiction, right? Which of course he did. But even in the episodes that were very serious and based on serious themes, there was always levity. There were always moments of humor. There was almost always a kind of a funny tag at the end, not almost always, but many times. So yeah, that's just part of life. And, in the Orville, when we, in the room, coming up with stories, we rarely think about the funny. Seth keeps us laughing a lot of the time because he's just so funny, and he does impressions and he pokes fun at us and himself, and it's such a joy to be in that room. I have to say, I miss it terribly. When we went into lockdown, I was in a production meeting for a season 3 episode on Friday, March 13th. And, we were all talking about COVID and what's going on. And then later that day, as we got out of the meeting, it's like, well, looks like we're going to shut down for a few weeks. And that was the last time I set foot on those sets for well over a year. And when we went back into production, it was under very strict COVID protocols. And I used to love going down to the set and hanging out, and was there a lot, especially it was an episode that Brandon and I had written, wanted to be down there for it. Couldn't go. I was not required on set. The scripts had all been written, and Seth had done his notes, and he would call us occasionally, and he called me, called Brandon, called David, whoever, for, talking about some revisions as we were shooting for various, practical reasons, but didn't get to go on the set again until shortly before, I think we were close to wrapping season 3, and they wanted to do some of these so-called electronic press kits where they interview us to talk about the show. And so we did those on the set, and the day that they were not shooting, or they were shooting on a different stage or something. And so that was the last time I saw the sets.
Wow.
That was sad.
That is sad. A lot of different losses happened because of COVID, and just even if it's not a life loss, your quality of life has changed too. And a lot of us are fortunate. I was fortunate. I didn't experience a lot of loss, but still are having to shift what brought us joy is also very impactful.
It was very tough, and I could kind of watch while we were shooting once we got back after, COVID, and we'd figured out all of our safety protocols and, put up plexiglass barriers and new air filtration systems on the stages and all of that jazz. And I could, I had a little app that I could use to watch them film. And it's like, God, it's really, it's really an odd constraint to have to work under, to see everybody standing around in masks until the cameras roll.
and not being able to see someone's facial expressions.
Yeah.
The context lost in that, the mirror neuron effect that it has.
Yes. And, and the schedule, we used to shoot 5 days a week, 12 hours a day, right? And there's a mandatory 12-hour turnaround for the crew. So as the week progressed, we typically started and ended later and later and later. So the end of the week, you might be starting at 3 p.m. and not finishing until 3 or 4 a.m. on a Friday to Saturday night. And then half your Saturday is already gone because you don't wake up until late in the afternoon. But we moved to a 4-day, 10-hour schedule, I think, once we got back into production, which was great for the cast and crew, really. But it's part of the reason that, it's taken us so long to finish season 3. We started writing season 3 in 2019, I guess.
At that point,
somebody was asking me something about the first script Brandon and I wrote for this season. Oh gosh.
Sure, because the last episode aired roughly 3 years ago.
Yeah.
The last episode of season 2.
Right.
Which was April-ish of 2019. So I think initially you were looking at a fall 19 start or maybe early.
Yeah, no, it was summer of 19. I think we got the writers back together and started working on that. Because we did another season of Cosmos between, and then, but I remember, I forget what we were looking at, but, it was about, I think the second episode maybe of season 3. And I'm like, God, I don't remember. I had to get the script. And, the date on it was like over 3 years ago. Holy crap. I can't, it's weird. It seems like no time in some ways. And it seems like forever in other ways.
It's amazing that the cast is all together, right?
Yeah.
Everybody's back. Am I correct in saying that?
You are correct.
That's
And,
tough. Arrested Development struggled with that when they went back into reshoots for the newer seasons.
Right.
That's actually what I was thinking of when you were talking about how shows have the opportunity to get their audiences. Arrested Development was like the last of its kind and the first of its kind, where you didn't have streaming services yet, but they were trying to do jokes that carried on for episodes. But if you missed 2 episodes, you missed 7 jokes that happened in the next episode.
Right.
But then it finds its feet on a Netflix. So in a way, we are fortunate that as storytellers, we get to tell more in-depth stories because you don't need to spend the time. And I'm not rewriting the books. Everyone knows this, but you don't need to rewrite. You don't need to say, "Hey, remember what happened last week when you were in the shuttle all day long?" But you do. So you do have some. You get those 2 minutes of not having to do exposition back.
Right.
And so my quick question for you is, I have one that's heady, but this one's my quick question. But when you were getting into the writer's room for season 3 at the time in 2019, etc., was that still going to be on Fox, or had Hulu expressed interest, or what happened with that? Do you remember?
We had already, the decision had already been made to move us to Hulu.
That makes sense because...
I don't remember exactly when that happened, but certainly by the time we started writing season 3, it was 90%, if not 100% clear that season 3 was going to be on Hulu.
Because David Goodman said that it was a barn burner every episode. So if you're still on Fox, I imagine that's not the case when you're writing you're not going, oh, what's next? Or we only have 10 episodes. Let's make it happen.
Oh, well, the primary difference, and, Fox was a great home for the show. But as a network show, you're constrained in time. You only have 45 minutes to tell your story. And that's just kind of hard and fast. We did get, I think, an extra minute and a half or 2 minutes for the second season of the Orville on Fox, which meant that they cut a couple of commercials, right?
They cut the intro a couple of times too.
Yeah.
Very abbreviated intro.
But that's, that was as much time as we were going to get.
But that's huge for a network to cut a commercial.
It is. But, our ambitions for season 3 were great. And we had discovered in season 2 that even having that extra couple of minutes really kind of opened up the storytelling in an interesting way and gave us opportunities to do some inventive, new, fun VFX stuff that probably would have been the first thing to get cut if the episode was long and we had to bring it back to, fit the commercial breaks. So the big advantage of being on a streaming service is that we were not given any time constraint in terms of the length of episodes. I mean, it doesn't mean we could do 5-hour episodes, but they are all significantly longer than the shows we did on Fox, and we took advantage of that, right? So they're more cinematic. They're more like little movies each episode. The scope of the show is greater in a lot of ways, and that's the big change in making the transition from a network to a streaming service.
I'm going to incorporate a Mike question that I get to see that you don't get to see, and he wants to ask about science deniers, but I want to ask it in tandem with another question. You were talking about how we were talking about early on about how arts and science intersect, and you get to experience both of these passions for yourself. And one of the things that Mike and I recognize in the storytelling of the Orville is there's multiple episodes that really deal with how science and education and religion intersect. So I'm curious of how, like, where do you fall in the religious or like, so you're talking about synchronicity. Synchronicity is closer to my religion, and the universe being connected is closer to my religion than having a religion. I was raised Catholic, so I'm just curious: how do you feel about science deniers? Do you feel like that's a symptom of religion? It's obviously a symptom of politics, but how much is that conversation also present in the writer's room for you all as well?
Oh, it's certainly one of the things we talk about, and the krill are the sort of the embodiment of those kinds of concepts and conflicts. The idea that which I think Seth stated in one of the episodes, is that virtually every spacefaring species in the Orville universe, by the time they develop something like quantum drive and can get out and encounter other intelligent species, they realize, if they hadn't already, that they're not the center of the universe anymore. Krill never quite got over that. They still think they're the center of the universe.
Right.
And I don't think it's so much a question of a conflict between science and religion. Plenty of religions have no trouble with science, right? Buddhism has no problem with science. It's a pretty big religion. It's really only the fundamentalists. The Catholic Church officially has no problem with, Big Bang theory and evolution.
Sure.
They see a divine hand, in the order and structure in the universe. Great. I don't think that that's anti-scientific. It's the fundamentalists in whatever religion that are problematic with respect to science. People who want to deny human evolution, people who want to, tell you that, we're standing on the, on the brink of Armageddon because that's what the Bible allegedly says, and it's going to be this big war between good and evil that's going to start in Israel or whatever the current doctrine might be. It's that level of denialism and delusion, I think, that is problematic for not just science but the world. And there are plenty of deeply religious people who are also,
open-minded science believers.
Like first-rate scientists, like Francis Collins, who's the head of the NIH. He's, biologist, geneticist. He considers himself a born-again Christian. He obviously believes in human evolution, and he believes that the universe is, as best as we can tell, about 13.8 billion years old. For him, that's not a problem. For most religious people, that's not a problem.
You're right, too. It's not fair to lop in this is the problem. But fundamentalists even, or extremists on either side of the political spectrum as well. Right. And in any religion, the fundamentalists seem to be the ones that want others to believe what they believe as well.
Exactly, for whatever weird insecurities or whatever reasons they have. But
Correct.
And that's the problem with the world, as I see it, is kind of like it only takes a handful of the extremists who really muck things up for everybody else, and that's the thing that I most fear about in terms of prospects for the future. I think most people are good, genuine, kind people who just want to live their lives and maybe do some good in the world and have meaningful relationships and maybe find some small measure of wisdom in their later years, right? And then you get the crazies who get power for whatever reasons and manage to fool a lot of people for some short period of time and create terrible problems that are going to continue to be vexing future generations for decades to come. I think about my 23-year-old nephew, who's a graduate student in applied mathematics down at the University of Arizona. Brilliant kid, really great. His girlfriend is a second-year med student, and there's so many promising young people in the world. And it makes me angry that we're, leaving them with such terrible problems, not of their creation, that
Correct.
we could have solved decades ago if we'd just been a little bit less selfish, I think.
I went to hear David Wolf speak at Purdue a couple of years ago, and he said, the best have never been better. But we get this kind of nagging feeling that things aren't right. And that kind of brings us full circle back to a comment you made about Ray Bradbury, which was, I'm not trying to predict the future. I'm trying to prevent it.
Yes.
I'm trying to warn people about these kind of things so that they take a good hard look at us. We cannot thank you enough for your time. I would like to ask you one more question, and I'm going to give you a little context. I understand that it was you that came up with the idea of the Retepsian pheromone. And that is what attracted DiRulio and
I
Kelly.
mean, let's be fair. We don't need any excuse to be attracted to Rob Lowe.
So the question I have for you was, at the end of Cupid's Dagger,
Yes.
they asked Rob Lowe if he was in heat when Kelly and DiRulio had the affair earlier, and he said, maybe.
Yeah.
Was DiRulio in heat during that first affair?
I think everybody can draw their own conclusions.
That's what we did.
That.
Yeah.
I don't think I came up with the pheromone. I think I came up with the idea that the Navidians and the Berudians were actually descendants of the same common ancestor. I think that was my idea.
And the pheromone just kind of brought those two together
from the beginning.
I was so ready for that too. Oh yeah, what did you say, Mike? I don't think.
I said that it was the pheromones that brought the Beruidians and the Berudians together. Right.
And that script was written by the amazing Liz Heldens, by the way.
And that's what I love about just a fun. So I do long form improvised. Like we'll do like an improvised Star Trek. So we learn how to tell a story on its feet. And as I've gotten better at that, because I'm better at acting than writing, even though I like writing. But I can't be forced to sit down. It's not my thing.
Yeah, that's hard.
It's hard. It's hard for me. Yeah. But when I start going, ooh, I have a feeling this is what's going to happen. They're looking at an old culture, and these two cultures are fighting. I love seeing I want to be a fly in the wall when you are breaking story, and it's like, oh, this could happen if these two things. Anyway,
again, that was a lot of fun. And by the way, Rob Lowe, huge original Lost in Space fan.
Oh, that's awesome.
So a few times that I saw him between takes, and we would chat for a few minutes. We talked about Lost in Space.
How charming! I think that's the best part of the world. Kids. That's the best part of the world we live in, is where maybe if you were a Star Trek fan 30 years ago, it might not have been the coolest thing, but right now it's the coolest thing to like geeky stuff, and I'm grateful for that.
Yes.
Well, what are you working on outside of the world of the Orville, or
we're still we're still in post on the Orville and on The End Is Nigh. I have a little bit of involvement in that. As I review some VFX shots and stuff. I had dinner with our VFX supervisor Brandon Fayette, who is an amazing, talented, unbelievably smart guy. I mean, they throw the word genius around a lot in Hollywood. Brandon is a true genius. He's invented stuff, that we've used, technologies that have made our lives easier on the show. And so I still have some involvement in that. And other than that, I'm just kind of, thinking about the next thing. And I'm working on a spec pilot, the usual Hollywood shuffle. So, I may be past my sell-by date as Hollywood writers go, but I'm hoping I can continue to work with Seth, with Brandon, with David Goodman.
I hear they're taking those labels off of everything. So there's no more sell-by, no more.
Oh, right.
No more shelf life.
I hope so, because I'd like to do this for a few more years. And man, if we were to get a fourth season of the Orville, I'd be in hog heaven.
We will do everything we can to help you do that. And where can people follow your goings on social media?
Oh, I got nothing.
You got nothing?
On Twitter.
I'm so jealous of
Facebook, I guess. I have a website, skybynightproductions.com,
Great.
but it's nothing. There are cat pictures there. You can see cat pictures if you go there.
I'm going to go right now.
And some astronomical photographs that I've taken over the years and a few other things. But
well, you're going to get a couple of hits on that right after we log off today. And we got to have you back on the show because we've got a long list of things to talk about. And, we talked philosophy, we talked cats, we talked human condition.
We didn't even get into the operating principles of the quantum drive.
We didn't talk about
I
grand
have
unified
so many
theory.
questions.
We didn't talk about Miguel Alcubierre. We didn't talk about a lot of things. So next
Our
time we'll come
starship
back.
doesn't work that way. When Seth came up with quantum drive, I talked to a friend of mine who's a college friend. He became a plasma physicist and designed one of the plasma engines for the Dawn spacecraft that went and orbited Vesta and Ceres. Brilliant guy, Joel Sercel. He turned me on to Roger Penrose's theory of quantum gravity, which is where the quantum drive really lives.
All right, mission log, the Orville,
Kiki.
and this supplemental interview
Whoa.
That
He's trying to dig in a plant.
is brought to you by Everybody's Cat and Roddenberry Entertainment. Our website and your opportunity to connect is podcast.roddenberry.com.
Bye, Andre. Thank you.
Thank you. It's so great to meet both of you, and thank you for having me on.
This is a Roddenberry podcast. For more great podcasts, visit podcast.roddenberry.com.